So I'm very happy to welcome Mark Power onto the sofa here at the Martin Parr Foundation. You're about to launch your second edition of the shipping forecast, more of that later. So let's go right back. Can you remember and recall when you first got excited by the idea of photography, and what was it that you saw that did that trick?
I discovered an enlarger that belonged to my dad in the loft at home in Leicester when I was about 15. Dad, what's this? And so we brought it downstairs, and he had all the developing stuff and all the tanks and things. So we went out and bought some chemicals, and I went out and took some absolutely, truly dreadful photographs of some trees. And then we processed the films, and then we made a few little prints. And he had this because he was a sort of unofficial ship's photographer when he was in the Merchant Navy. He was worked in the engine room. He was an engineer, but he also used to take photographs of these distant oil tankers on the horizon, always with an impeccable straight horizon. I get that from my dad. And years ahead of the Beshers in many ways, because they're all exactly the same. The only thing that changes is the oil tanker. There was that. So that was my sort of introduction into the alchemy of it all. But it never crossed my mind at that point that I might want to be a photographer. So I went off and I did a fine art degree. And then in my final year, I went up to London to see a Mark Rothko exhibition, the American-Russian abstract expressionist painter. And we'd been taught how to look at a Rothko painting so that you focus slightly behind it, and then if you concentrate enough, the whole painting starts to wobble in front of you, and you get this kind of strange sensation. So I did that. I went to see the show and I got the wobbly paintings, and that all worked for me. And then I came out and I had a Time Out London with me. And I just thought, I'll go and see something else. And I'd only heard of two photographers at that time. One was Bill Brandt and the other was Don McCullin. And there was a McCullin show, I think somewhere on the South Bank. So I went to see that. And at one point, I was in a room alone with just one other person, a woman, who was looking at the work, and she was in floods of tears. Now, of course, there could be any number of reasons why she was upset, but I like to think that she was deeply affected by the pictures that she was seeing. And of course, that made me think about the directness of the photography's ability to be able to communicate. I'm taking a lot of leaps in the dark here, but let's just imagine further that this woman hadn't had any training in how to read a photograph or anything. It was just, it just reached her on a very basic level. And whereas you had to learn how to look at a Rothko painting. And so I liked the kind of democracy of photography immediately. And I just thought, this is really interesting. And I was quite obsessed with the idea of trying to be an artist at that point, and whatever that meant. And it's not something I call myself now, by the way. But it didn't make me think that I'd done the wrong course or anything. It made me think about photography in a different way. Obviously, I knew about photography, but I didn't know. For me, a career in photography was really, taking wedding pictures or working for a newspaper, and that was about it. I didn't know there was any other way of working, so it was a kind of revelation to me to see.
But you ended up being more of a photojournalist in the first instance.
Yes, because I was very influenced by that McCullin show, and I actually went away travelling for 2 years. Soon after I saw that show, after I graduated, a few months after I left, I went away to Southeast Asia, and I ended up in Australia and travelled around and worked here and there. And so very typical sort of route, the 2 year sojourn. And I took a sketchbook with me, and I took a £50 Fujica camera with a standard lens. Almost never did I take my my sketchbook out, because I don't know, maybe I thought the photography was easier, perhaps, at the time. I don't think that now. Also, I think that there's something very public about taking your sketchbook out when people coming and looking over your shoulder at what you're doing. So I just didn't feel comfortable doing that. So yeah, I came back from that trip, and I hadn't processed any of the films while I was travelling. I had to send them all back to my parents because I had no way of processing anything. So looking at those contact sheets now, I see this really slow progression from film 1 to film 200, because I wasn't learning from my mistakes. They do get better, and to a certain extent, in the sort of Kappa frame of mind, I was actually getting closer to things, but very, very slow progress. And I wrote to McCullin afterwards, and I said I'd done this trip and I'd really like to show him some pictures. And he said to me, "The third world doesn't need any more photographers. You should be working in your own country." He wrote me a letter on Sunday Times headed notepaper, which I've still got. 4 pages, just telling me, a bit of a rant it was, but it was very kind and well-meaning about, and he was right, of course, that going off and making those kind of pictures of developing countries. I've never met Don McCullin, but he was a really important influence in those early years for me, and also those wise words to say, work in your own country.
I mean, that's very generous
decades.
of him to write you a 4-page letter.
Absolutely.
It's impressive. But then how did you start getting work? I mean, I've seen your catalogue of, I think, some children's charity. How did you get work like that?
So with those pictures from Asia, I had them accepted by the Photographers Gallery print room. And then I think somebody from an advertising agency came in to ask if they could recommend somebody to do a commission about what it was like to be young and growing up in Thatcher's Britain. And I don't know how many people they put forward, but I was the chosen one, and so that was my first proper commission. I did a few little odds and ends for the Observer in between, but that was my first long-term project.
But at that point, did you think you'd be a photojournalist rather than, say, a fine artist?
Yeah, absolutely. That's because I believed then that photography could change the world. And 4 years later, I realised, after trying so hard, that it wasn't happening. And that was also the point where I'd gone backwards financially so much, because I was making this work that nobody wanted to publish, because it was... the magazines were very much in the control of the advertising industry then, and they didn't want that kind of, the kind of pictures that I was making. They did not want to advertise them in the pages next to their adverts for their perfume and so forth. So it was a disaster, and that's when I happened to be in Berlin by mistake, and everything changed. So I'd given up. Pretty much the idea of being a professional photographer, because I was so much in debt. I had Barclaycard taking me to court for 25 grand. That's how bad it was, and that was bad. Wow. In 1989.
That's a lot of money then.
And then out of the blue, an old friend gave me £200 out of his own pocket and said, just have one last go. So I flew to Berlin on a story that's too long and convoluted to tell you now, but I arrived in Berlin, checked into the youth hostel with my friend George. We went out for a walk that night. Even though we were exhausted, we went to Checkpoint Charlie. There was a lot of people there. Well, there's 100 people there, say. So I asked somebody what was going on, and they said, "We think the wall will fall tonight." And this was the day I'd arrived. I'd literally been in Berlin about 2 hours. So we rushed back to our youth hostel, grabbed all our stuff, went back again, managed to get our way to the front of Checkpoint Charlie. But Checkpoint Charlie is a wide space, and bang on midnight, the door right in front of us, I mean literally in front of George and I, opened, and we were pushed through into no man's land. So it was like an extraordinary tale of good fortune.
So how did you send the pictures back before the days of the
I
internet?
I went to the airport and put them on a courier flight. I had the wherewithal to do that. I'd
Having printed them in
no, I
in
wasn't there.
Berlin?
It was just the net. It was just the
the
rolls of film.
contacts.
It was just the rolls of film.
Ah.
That's all it was. And so, and to my eternal shame, the Daily Mail bought them because they paid the most money. And those 12 rolls of film, the negatives are all purple and green now because they weren't processed properly. They weren't fixed properly because it was, tomorrow's fish and chip paper, as they say.
Mm-hmm.
But it rescued my career, and I was off again. And then I had 3 years of working for the media. It was as if I had my finger on the pulse of what was going on in Eastern Europe. So I was asked where I'd like to go next.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to Poland and I went to Bulgaria, where all the real action, if you like, was happening in Czechoslovakia and in Romania, of course, where there was a civil war. The places I went to, the governments just politely stepped aside, and there was no revolution or anything.
But this makes it sound as if you were more of a photojournalist.
Still, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I worked a lot for Sunday Telegraph, was kind of a retainer for them, and they used to send me on these really daft day jobs like bus spotters conventions and Michael Jackson lookalike competitions and things, which I loved doing, and I have to say it gave me a lot of things to talk about when I was... Well, I used to get invited to a lot more dinner parties than I do now because I was quite entertaining company back then. I had 2 incidents where I did a job for the Sunday Times magazine, which was living for a month in an estate in Kirby in Merseyside, and me and a writer we lived in the Catholic priest's house, and photographed the community over a month. And funnily enough, certain people were saying to me, "You're not going to, shit all over us like that other photographer did, are you?" And that other photographer was McCullin, who also did the same estate for the Sunday Times magazine about 15 years before, and the piece that had come out so upset the community that they really despised him. So I said, no, I'm trying to show really balance for you here. But of course, when I sent the pictures in to the Sunday Times, I lost all control of them. And lo and behold, out comes a 10-page piece with the cover of our time on that estate. And it made me realise that the writer, he could write a very balanced piece, but the photographer is very much in the control of the picture editor, or the editor probably. It was Andrew Neil at the time. And so it came out, and I got all this hate mail from these people that I'd told to trust me, and understandably they were really upset. The other one was a job in a nudist camp for Marie Claire magazine, but I don't think we should go there. That was, but those 2 experiences together just were so upsetting, and it happened that I had that a job came up teaching on this new course called editorial photography at the University of Brighton, degree course. So I sort of rather reluctantly applied for the job. I remember asking in the interview how long the holidays were. And but I got the job, surprisingly, and I just thought I need to lead by example by doing a long-term project myself, and that's when I started doing the shipping forecast, which was an idea that had been rattling around in my head for a couple of years.
Yeah, what was it that made you think about the shipping forecast as being a good starting point?
Because I bought a tea towel in the Royal National Lifeboat Institute shop in Great Yarmouth, and it showed a map of the sea areas of the shipping forecast. And I'd never actually thought about these places, Dogger, Fisher, German, Bight, etc., being real geographical locations. They were just sort of names in the ether to me. And I remember thinking, oh, that's where Dogger is, that's where German Bight is, that's where North Sea is. How interesting! And actually, probably subconsciously thinking about what those places would look like, because, like, so many people in this country, millions of people in this country, we've listened to the shipping forecast all our lives without meaning to. I mean, I was never a fan of it, but it was always there, and I recognised that it held a very important place in British culture, emphasising this idea that we're this island nation, buffeted by wind and waves, and how everybody thinks that, we listening to the midnight forecast with the rain hammering on the windows is so romantic, because you're thinking about all of those heroic people at sea. I thought it would be interesting then to go to all of those 31 sea areas to see if the imaginary landscapes that are built up in my mind were anything like the reality. And that kind of idea of myth and reality is something that I've pursued all my career, actually, ever since. There is a sort of a theme that goes through everything I've done.
And then you changed to medium format. I mean, that almost like tells us that your approach to photography is going to be very different.
Yeah, I've been using a 6.9 camera, actually, for 2 years. On a project I did called Beyond the Facade, which was kind of about homelessness in Brighton. So that was a Fuji 6.9, but then I invested in a Mamiya 6, which was just such a great camera. And I really wanted to work on a square format. I thought that would be an interesting challenge. And I know you've done, I think did you shoot
Stoke with
Mamiya 6, yeah. So it's an interesting format to work in, isn't it? Because you don't have to think about landscape or portrait, but it comes with a lot of other problems because you get a lot of sky and a lot of ground, of course, that you don't always want. And so there are kind of tricks that you can use to fill the frame, and I worked those out over the 4 years I was working on the shipping forecast. But I felt like I'd taken that format as far as I could.
And then, of course, you thought about getting it published as a book.
It was quite a roller coaster to try and get it published. I was turned down by one or two fairly major publishing houses. Other publishers wanted me to pay for everything, and it just didn't seem like it was going to happen. And then I won this award from Luxembourg, of all places, called the Mosaic Award for European Photography, which was $25,000, which was, again, a lot of money in those days. So that enabled me to put money into finishing the work, because I'd left all the expensive places to get to, the more difficult, like Southeast Iceland and Norwegian coast. I'd left those to the end in the hope that something good would happen. And also put money into the book, of course, which I did with Zelda Cheadle, and then and also put the exhibition on, the kind of exhibition that I wanted to do, which was kind of all singing, all dancing affair.
And one of the things about that project is it went beyond the photography sort of world into a wider world, because it got reprinted twice, once hardback and then 3
printings altogether,
and then into softback.
A variety of hardbacks and softbacks in the days when we were doing those kind of
How
things.
did you manage to push it out of the photography world?
I don't know, actually. I was lucky that the Observer made it their book of the week when the first edition came out, and it was gone in 10 days. There were 2,000 copies. It was just before Christmas. And there's a lot of people out there, I now realised, I suddenly realised, that were Radio 4 listeners that were interested in the shipping forecast. This idea that somebody was offering images of these places for the first time, and as far as I know, it was the first time. I did get a couple of, angry letters from people. One person especially said, he said literally, you have denied me my radio dreams.
And then you went into a world of a combination of your own projects and being commissioned. You did the Millennium Dome, of course. How was that as a project?
Well, as a result of the shipping forecast being published, I was given a day job to fly over the site of a proposed building in East London. It was very hush-hush at the time. So it was a piece of waste ground. And then I didn't really think much more about it. And then May 1997, when Tony Blair and the Labour Party swept to power, everybody thought they were going to shelve the Millennium Dome. It was not going to happen. We knew what it was by then, but because it was a Michael Heseltine project originally for the Tory party. But Blair famously stood up and embraced the whole idea and said it would be a symbol of New Labour and New Britain. And so then I spent probably 4 to 5 months trying to get access to the site, because I felt like I felt some ownership of it, because I'd already spent a day over it and on it, and I wanted to do something that was dare I say a little bit architectural, but not, because I'm not an architectural photographer. But I was looking at a lot of Thomas Struth at the time and a lot of Gursky, and I bought myself a large format camera, and so it seemed to me, and it was a project about the Millennium, because you remember we were all scrambling around trying to find a project that was about this remarkable
So
thing.
at this initial point, you hadn't actually been commissioned?
I hadn't been commissioned, and I was sending them photocopies of 19th century photographs of building projects, because in the 19th century it was quite fashionable or quite normal for a photographer to follow the construction of a great public building from beginning to end.
Yeah.
And they kept rejecting me all the time, saying, "You're not coming in, you're not coming in." And I think in the end they just got so sick of me, but they said, "We'll only let you in if we pay you." And I wasn't expecting that. I didn't know you could get paid for doing something you really wanted to do. Of course, what they thought was that they would have some kind of control over the pictures. But the alarm bells rang in my head a little bit, and I said, "Well, I'd love to accept your very kind offer, but I do not want to come in as a commercial photographer. I don't want to be there when the architect and the Prime Minister are shaking hands. You need to get somebody else for that. You need to just let me come and do my own work." And amazingly, they agreed to that. And
to keep the copyright.
And to keep the copyright, yes. So they paid me to go twice a month, but I went every week for 2.5 years, and since then I've had 21 years of, I'm not doing one at the moment, but 21 consecutive years of working on a kind of construction project from the Millennium Dome through the Treasury, and then the A380, the Airbus, a huge aeroplane. The rebuilding of King's Cross, Macallan, of course, and so at the moment I'm working on a new book which takes all of those pictures out of context. It's a little bit like the Evidence, the Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel book, where it takes those sort of strange pictures out of context and mixes them all up, and I'm really excited about it.
But at the same time, I mean, you're now very well known for your quite long-term personal projects.
Yeah.
We had Poland, which I guess stretched over 3 or 4 years, and now the monumental American project, which you're, I guess, 2/3 of the way through. Why did you decide to do those projects when the sort of commercial work was so satisfactory? Did you feel you were missing something?
Yeah. Yes.
And what was that?
Well, I think the commercial projects, as you call them, tended to be...
Well, you call them that too.
Yeah, I guess. Construction projects I tend to call them, but it doesn't matter. They tend to have quite tight parameters in as much as you're working in a quite confined space, is what not being told what to do, and so these other projects, like in Poland and in America, are very much about roaming. It's about like massive spaces, and so they're the antithesis of that. So I found that the two things work very well in conjunction with each other. Right, I'm sure you're the same, working on more than one project at once. Just balance, all these balls in the air at the same time to keep you occupied and interested.
Well, I haven't got anything as monumental as what you're investing and shooting now in America, for example.
Yes, well, that was going to be a 10-year project from the beginning. It's now turned into a 12-year project because I couldn't go for 2 years.
And how many volumes?
It's going to be 5 volumes. I'm now working on volume 4. So,
and the idea is to go to every state.
Touch wood. I will.
So,
get there.
I mean, America is one of the most photographed countries in the world. What are you going to bring to it that the American photographers have missed?
I told you not to ask me any hard questions. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I never. I was always very suspicious of photographers that thought they could get under the skin of a foreign country by spending a lot of time there or learning a language or whatever. I just never, and I always felt like my best work was always going to be made in the UK. But my experience of working in Poland made me challenge that assumption a little bit within my own head. And because of the kind of feedback I was getting from Polish people, other Polish photographers, that there's something about it's a lot wrapped up in the kind of equipment that I use as well, which allows me this kind of distance and but extraordinarily sharp images with lots and lots of details. So it's somebody once called it an intimate distance, if you like. So which is two polar opposites, but kind of coming together. And so I hope that this outsider's perspective can offer something a little bit different. I like to think that I'm making work for history, but I'm also being very self-indulgent in many ways and doing a project that I've wanted to do all my life.
And do you imagine in due course you'll do something very similar approach in the UK?
Yes, absolutely. I feel that this has really got rid of my wanderlust, and I want to come back to this country. I was so fed up after Brexit that I just thought I didn't want to ever work here again. But I feel very differently about that. I don't feel differently about Brexit, but I feel differently about my relationship to this country and feeling that I want to go out there and make another project here. But we'll see.
And then let's get to the second edition of the Shipping Forecast, which is why you're here tonight to give a talk. What made you decide to go through your archive of Shipping Forecast pictures, find new pictures, and do this completely new book?
Well, I self-published the pictures from Berlin 25 years after the event. And that taught me how documentary photography can become so much more, maybe not interesting, but certainly very different, and often more interesting, actually, with the passing of time. And it was during the second lockdown period that I was thinking, maybe I should think about doing the Shipping Forecast again, but not reproducing the same book, making something totally different. So I have about 1,200 rolls of film, I think, so of square 120 film, so 12 times 12, it's about 14,400 pictures. And I don't take many pictures of the same thing. I'm quite decisive about, and then I move on. So there was an enormous wealth of work there that I hadn't really thought about using before, looked at before. I went through the contacts and I made some new scans, made lots of 12 by 10 digital prints, and 500 in fact, and they're just a massive pile. And they sat on my desk for 2 or 3 months. I just couldn't bring myself to look at them because it just felt so overwhelming. The job of actually making sense of all of this, but with Stuart Smith's help, I made a start and got into the swing of it and worked out a way of sequencing and pairing the pictures together, which was it was time consuming, but it was very effective actually.
And now, in fact, there's more new pictures than there were old pictures, isn't that right?
Yes, there were 60 in the original book, and there's 163 in this new one. So everything in the original book is in the second book, except one picture, which I don't like anymore. So
oh dear. Okay, that's great. One question I just want to ask you before we finish is, I have a memory somewhere in my deep consciousness of you coming and crashing into my room at Houston Photo Festival. Is that right?
It is right.
When was that?
Right. That was in 1986, and that was the British Photography. Well, there were 6 of you there. There was you, Graham Smith, Chris Killip, Brian Griffin, Paul Graham, and John Davis. And you very kindly let me crash in your room, as did Graham Smith, actually. But Graham let me sleep in his bed with him. You didn't. You made me sleep on the floor.
Whoops. I didn't think it would come back and bite me 40 years later, but there you go.
So, no, you were very generous, because I just turned up. I don't know why I even went there, but I just, it was the portfolio reviews and everything. It went horribly badly for me. But we have to go through these things, don't we? We have to be told, that we're... I mean, I remember you saying something really quite critical of a show I had at Farnham many, many years ago. Remember you telling me the exhibition was very weak.
Oh, dear.
And I was so upset about that. But you were right. You were absolutely right in retrospect. And you get knocked down, you have to stand up again, and you have to think about why someone said that. And because, of course, you were someone I looked up to and still look up to. And so I had to think about why you said that. And I learned from that. So thank you.
Well, I think you've come on pretty good since then. Thank you, Mark, for talking to us.
Thanks, Martin.
Good luck with the second edition of the Shipping Forecast.
Thanks very much.